They called him Old Man Vance, sometimes just the fossil. For 5 years, Elias Vance had shuffled through the gleaming, chaotic corridors of Metro General's emergency department, a ghost in faded grey scrubs. He was the one who changed the overflowing sharps containers, who mopped up the unspeakable fluids, who restocked the suture kits with gnarled, slow-moving hands. He was background noise, a piece of worn-out furniture. The younger nurses, sleek and swift in their expensive danskos, would roll their eyes as his slight limp slowed him down. The doctors, particularly the department's golden boy, Dr. Adrian Sterling, treated him as something less than human, an inconvenient relic from a forgotten era of medicine. They didn't know that the rasp in his voice came from a trachea scarred by shrapnel. They didn't know the limp was a souvenir from a Black Hawk helicopter that had decided to meet the ground faster than designed. They didn't know that the old man, who dutifully cleaned their messes, had, on a sun-scorched mountainside, held the life of a 4-star general in his hands and refused to let it go. They didn't expect the day would come when a 280-pound convicted murderer, high on PCP and rage, would snap surgical steel restraints like they were made of thread. They certainly didn't expect the timid old nurse to be the only thing standing between that monster and a room full of helpless people. Elias Vance wasn't just a tired janitorial nurse. He was a weapon wrapped in a shroud of humility, and the world had forgotten how to be careful around him. The air in the Metro General ER was a familiar, toxic cocktail. It smelled of antiseptic, stale coffee, blood, and the faint, cloying sweetness of diabetic ketoacidosis. It was a smell Elias knew better than fresh air. Fluorescent lights, buzzing like trapped insects, cast a sterile, unforgiving glare on everything, making the sick look sicker and the tired look ancient. Elias was running the inventory check on Crash Cart 2, his movements deliberate, methodical. Each vial of epinephrine, each ampule of atropine, each laryngoscope blade was accounted for, its expiration date noted in his small, neat ledger. It was a task assigned to the newest nursing students, yet here he was, 58 years old, performing it for the 3rd time this week. Because Dr. Sterling liked things triple-checked. "Vance!" The voice was a whip-crack across the already frayed nerves of the ER. Dr. Adrian Sterling stood, arms crossed, a vision of tailored navy blue scrubs and a ridiculously expensive watch. His teeth were too white, his hair too perfect. He looked less like a doctor who waded through human misery and more like an actor playing one on a daytime soap opera. "Did you or did you not restock the pediatric I-5 catheters in Trauma Bay 1? Elias didn't look up immediately. He finished noting the date on a pack of defibrillator pads. "Yes, sir, this morning. All gauges." "Then explain this," Sterling said, holding up a 24-gauge catheter package as if it were a piece of damning evidence in a murder trial. "I needed a 22. A 22. Is that too complex? Are the numbers too small for you to read, old man?" A few of the younger nurses, clustered around the central station, tittered. It was a familiar performance. Sterling's daily degradation of Elias was as much a part of the ER routine as the rhythmic beeping of the cardiac monitors. Elias finally raised his head. His eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, held a stillness that was often mistaken for vacancy. "The order requisition was for 24 seconds, sir. I filled it exactly as written." He kept his voice low, a dry rustle of leaves. Sterling scoffed, tossing the catheter onto the cart. "Initiative, Vance. It's called initiative. A good nurse anticipates needs. They don't just blindly follow orders like some programmed automaton. But I suppose that's too much to ask. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial hiss that was meant to carry. Frankly, I don't know why this hospital maintains a charity program for decrepit, washed-up nurses. You're a liability, a fossil. The word hung in the air. Fossil. Elias felt a familiar coldness settle deep in his gut. It wasn't anger. Anger was a hot, messy emotion he'd learned to discard decades ago. This was different. It was a precise, contained pressure, like a nitrogen tank waiting for a valve to turn. He remembered a different voice, a different time. They call him the surgeon, a young ranger had whispered in awe, his face caked in dust and blood. Seen him stitch a guy's heart back together with nothing but a needle driver and a whole lot of "don't you die on me." The memory was a flicker, a phantom limb of a life he'd buried. He blinked, the memory receding. "I will go and get the 22-gauge catheters, Dr. Sterling," he said, his voice perfectly monotone. He turned, his limp more pronounced under the weight of the collective stare. The nurses went back to their charting, the moment of casual cruelty already forgotten by everyone but the man who had to absorb it. As he shuffled towards the supply closet, he heard Sterling's voice again, loud and performative. "See? You have to treat him like a child. Specific, one-step commands." The laughter that followed was sharp, and it echoed in the sterile space long after it had died down. Elias closed the supply closet door behind him, the darkness a momentary comfort. He leaned his forehead against the cool metal, his eyes closed. He wasn't a liability, he was a promise that when things went truly, catastrophically wrong, he would be the one who did not break. And he had a feeling, a cold dread coiling in his stomach, that Dr. Sterling was the kind of man who inevitably brought catastrophe down on everyone around him. The humiliation didn't end with the catheter incident. It was a continuous, low-grade fever of contempt that spiked throughout the shift. An hour later, a patient in Bay 4, a belligerent drunk with a minor head laceration, vomited a stomach full of cheap whiskey and half-digested tacos onto the floor. Dr. Sterling, who had been attempting to suture the wound with theatrical but clumsy movements, recoiled in disgust. "My God, the smell! Get environmental services in here, now!" he barked at a passing nurse. Then his eyes found Elias, who was quietly charting a patient's vitals. A cruel smile touched Sterling's lips. "On second thought, don't bother. We have our own in-house janitor. Vance, clean this up. You're probably more familiar with this kind of work anyway." The ER fell into one of its periodic hushes. This was a new low, even for Sterling. Ordering a registered nurse, no matter how old or disliked, to perform a janitorial task was a profound breach of professional respect. It was a dominance play, pure and simple. Elias looked from the mess on the floor to Sterling's smug face. The younger nurses stared, some with pity, others with a kind of morbid curiosity, waiting to see if the old man would finally snap. He didn't. His face remained a placid mask. He simply nodded, placed his chart on the counter, and walked to the utility closet. He returned with a mop, a bucket, and a red biohazard bag. He didn't speak, he just knelt, the movement stiff and painful for his bad leg, and began methodically cleaning the filth. The air seemed to change. The quiet wasn't just quiet anymore, it was heavy, suffocating. The act of watching this quiet, dignified old man on his hands and knees, cleaning another man's vomit at the behest of an arrogant bully, was deeply uncomfortable. It felt wrong on a primal level. One of the younger nurses, a new graduate named Sarah with kind eyes, made a move to help. "Elias, let me," she began. Sterling cut her off with a glare that could freeze water. "Stay where you are, Nurse Miller. Let the man do his job." Sarah froze, her face flushed with shame and anger. Elias, without looking up, just shook his head slightly, a barely perceptible motion. Stay out of it. The message was clear. He didn't need her to fight his battles. He didn't need anyone. He methodically worked, the scrape of the mop the only sound in the bay. He was on another mountain, in another lifetime.
It wasn't vomit he was cleaning,
But blood. So much blood. His friends. He was the only one left standing, the only one who could put them back together, or tag their bodies for the long ride home. The smell of bile and whiskey was nothing. It was perfume compared to the memories locked away behind his pale blue eyes. When he finished, the floor was pristine, the air thick with the sharp scent of disinfectant. He disposed of the bag, cleaned the mop and bucket, and returned them to the closet. He washed his hands for a full 2 minutes at the scrub sink, his movements precise and ritualistic. When he turned around, Sterling was preening, accepting a cup of coffee from a sycophantic colleague. "See," Sterling said, loud enough for Elias to hear, "everything has its proper place. Everyone has their proper role." Elias met his gaze across the bustling room. For a fraction of a second, the placid mask slipped. Sterling saw something in the old man's eyes, not anger, not fear, but a vast, cold emptiness that seemed to stretch on forever. It was like looking into a deep, dark well. It was unsettling. Sterling frowned, the flicker of unease quickly replaced by his usual arrogance. He dismissed it, turning his attention back to his audience. It was just the old man, after all, a nobody, a fossil. But for the rest of the shift, Sterling found himself unconsciously avoiding Elias Vance's gaze, a prickle of discomfort he couldn't quite name. The balance of power felt the same, but the foundation beneath it had developed a hairline crack. The first siren was a distant, lonely cry against the backdrop of the city's evening hum. Then it was joined by another and another, until the air outside the ER windows was shredded by a chorus of escalating panic. It wasn't the sound of a single accident, it was the sound of a system breaking. A young resident, scrolling frantically on her phone, gasped. "Oh my God! A multi-car pileup on the I-5 overpass. A tanker truck was involved. They're saying dozens of casualties." The words landed like stones in the already tense room. The ER, which had been operating at its usual frantic pace, was about to be plunged into the seventh circle of hell. The charge nurse, a seasoned veteran named Maria, began barking orders, her voice cutting through the rising anxiety. "All hands! I want every bay cleared and prepped. All non-criticals to the waiting room or discharge. Get me the hospital supervisor on the line. We're initiating mass casualty protocol. Level 1. Dr. Sterling, who had been flirting with one of the nurses, suddenly snapped into action, though it was the action of a man playing a role rather than leading a team. People, let's move. I want triage stations set up at the ambulance bay doors. I'll be lead physician.
All decisions go through me.
Is that clear?" His voice was a little too loud, a little too shrill. He was projecting authority he didn't feel. Elias, who had been finishing his charting, simply put down his pen. He didn't rush. He walked, with his steady, limping gait, to the main supply room. While others were scrambling to find open beds, Elias was grabbing chest tube kits, IO drill kits, and tourniquets. He wasn't thinking about beds. He was thinking about the first 5 minutes. He was thinking about exsanguination, tension pneumothorax, and airway compromise. He was triaging the disaster before it had even arrived. The first wave hit like a tsunami. Gurneys crashed through the doors, pushed by paramedics with grim, sweat-streaked faces. The air filled with screams, moans, and the frantic recitation of injuries. Multiple fractures, possible internal bleeding, severe burns, compromised airway. Unresponsive male, GCS of 3. It was chaos. Bodies everywhere, a sea of pain and fear. Dr. Sterling stood near the entrance, trying to direct traffic, but he was a cork bobbing in a flood. He pointed a burn victim toward Trauma Bay 2, which was already occupied. He sent a patient with a clear spinal injury to a hallway bed without a C collar. He was overwhelmed, his carefully constructed facade of competence cracking under the pressure. Then came the prisoner. He was a monster of a man, strapped to a reinforced gurney with thick leather and steel restraints. 4 grim-faced police officers surrounded him, their hands hovering near their sidearms. The man's head was crudely bandaged, blood matting his hair, but his eyes were wide, wild, and blazing with a psychotic fire. "This is Marcus, the Rhino, Thorne," the lead officer yelled over the din. "He was being transported when his van was caught in the pileup. He's got a headlock and God knows what else, but he's high on something fierce.
Do not, I repeat,
Do not take your eyes off him." Sterling, seeing the commotion, strode over. "Put him in Bay 5. I'll assess him myself. I've handled high-risk patients before," he said, puffing out his chest. The officer looked Sterling up and down, unimpressed. "Just be careful, Doc." He snapped a pair of standard cuffs at the scene. They wheeled the gurney into the largest trauma bay. The man, Thorne, began to thrash, the heavy gurney rocking on its wheels. He let out a roar, a guttural, inhuman sound that silenced the surrounding chaos for a heartbeat. "I'm going to kill all of you," he bellowed, his voice raw. Sterling's face paled slightly. "Sedate him. 10 of Valium now," he ordered a nearby nurse. Elias, who had just finished applying a tourniquet to a man's mangled leg in the hallway, looked over at Bay 5. He saw Sterling's order. He saw the drug the man was on.
he saw the potential for disaster.
"Sir," Elias's raspy voice cut through, "benzodiazepines can have a paradoxical effect in patients on PCP. It could make him more agitated." Sterling whirled on him, his face a mask of fury. "Are you questioning my orders in the middle of a mass casualty, Vance? I am the doctor here. Now get out of my way and do something useful, like fetching bedpans." The command was a slap. Elias fell silent, his face unreadable. He gave a single, sharp nod and retreated, melting back into the chaos. But he didn't go to fetch bedpans. He positioned himself near the hallway entrance, his back to the wall, right outside Trauma Bay 5. He watched. He waited. And he remembered the first rule of survival. When the man in charge is a fool, you prepare for his foolishness to get people killed. The chaos in the ER had found a new, terrifying rhythm. It was a symphony of suffering, conducted by the relentless beep of failing monitors and the shouts of overworked staff. In the eye of this hurricane, Elias Vance moved with an eerie, preternatural calm. He wasn't fast, his limp a constant anchor, but he was efficient. He saw things others missed. While a junior resident struggled to find a vein on a dehydrated patient, Elias walked past, tapped the man's arm, and said in his quiet rasp, "Antecubital fossa is shot. Go for an external jugular or intraosseous." He didn't wait for a response, just moved on. The resident, after a moment of indignant surprise, tried the EJ line and got it on the first stick, his eyes widening in grudging respect. In Trauma Bay 3, A young woman was crashing. Her blood pressure was plummeting, her breathing shallow. Dr. Sterling had glanced at her chart for 5 seconds before declaring it a probable splenic rupture and ordering her prepped for the OR. But the ultrasound was inconclusive. The surgical team was slammed. She was dying, right here, right now.
Elias, passing by,
Noticed the faint bruising creeping up her chest and the distended veins in her neck. He saw the way her trachea was deviating slightly to the left. He didn't see a splenic rupture. He saw a tension pneumothorax, a killer you couldn't see on a simple X-ray. He didn't ask for permission. He didn't consult Sterling. He walked to the bay, grabbed a 14-gauge angiocath from the cart he had so meticulously stocked hours earlier, and approached the panicked nurse at the bedside. "Get me a Heimlich valve and a chest tube kit, now," he commanded. His voice wasn't a rasp anymore. It was steel. The nurse, startled by his tone, just stared. "But Dr. Sterling said—" "Dr. Sterling is wrong," Elias stated, not as an opinion, but as a fact. "She has less than 2 minutes. Move." The authority in his voice was absolute. The nurse scrambled to obey. Elias ripped open the patient's gown, swabbed her chest with alcohol, and with a single, practiced motion, plunged the large-bore needle into the second intercostal space. There was a sudden, explosive hiss of escaping air. The effect was instantaneous. The woman's body relaxed. The alarms on her monitor, which had been screaming a prelude to death, began to stabilize. Her blood pressure started to tick upward. It was like magic. It was like a miracle. It wasn't magic. It was expertise, forged in the crucible of combat. By the time Sterling swaggered over, drawn by the sudden cessation of alarms, the patient was breathing easier. "What the hell is going on here?" he demanded. The young nurse, Sarah, spoke up, her voice trembling with awe. "It was Elias. He did something with a needle. He saved her." Sterling looked at the needles sticking out of the woman's chest, at the now stable vitals, and then at Elias, who was calmly preparing the chest tube insertion site. Rage, pure and incandescent, flooded Sterling's face. This was his save, his department. This fossil, this janitor, had just performed a life-saving invasive procedure without his permission. "You are finished, Vance," he hissed, his voice low and shaking with fury. "Assaulting a patient, practicing medicine without a license. I will have you arrested and your nursing license revoked so fast your head will spin." Before Elias could respond, a sound from Trauma Bay 5 ripped through the ER. It was not a human sound. It was the screech of tortured metal giving way, followed by a wet, sickening crack. A police officer screamed, a sound of pure agony. The relative, controlled chaos of the mass casualty event suddenly curdled into something far worse. Raw, primal terror. Everyone froze. The beeping monitors, the groans of the injured, it all faded into a muffled backdrop. The single, dominant sound was the heavy, rhythmic breathing of something that had just broken free. The monster in Bay 5 was loose. The scene in Trauma Bay 5 was a tableau of violence. The reinforced gurney was twisted, one of the thick leather restraints torn completely from its steel anchor. The patient, Marcus, the rhino, Thorne, was on his feet. He was even bigger than he'd looked on the gurney, a 280-pound slab of muscle and PCP-fueled psychosis. One of the police officers lay on the ground, his leg bent at an unnatural angle, his face a mask of pain. The other 3 officers had their guns drawn, but they couldn't get a clear shot. Thorne had grabbed the nearest person, the young nurse, Sarah, who had been ordered to administer the Valium. He held her in a chokehold, her feet dangling inches off the floor, her face already turning a dusky purple. He was using her as a human shield. "Everybody back up!" Thorn roared, his eyes rolling wildly. "Back up, or I snap her neck! I want a car! I want out of here now!" Panic detonated. Nurses screamed and scattered. Patients who could move tried to crawl under their beds. The two remaining conscious officers yelled conflicting commands, their professionalism vaporized by adrenaline and fear. "Drop her, Thorn! Don't shoot! Don't shoot!" Dr. Sterling, who had been seconds away from eviscerating Elias, did something entirely predictable. He backed away. He didn't just step back, he scrambled backward, tripping over a discarded IV stand and falling to the floor. He crab-walked away from the danger, his face a grotesque canvas of terror, all his arrogance and authority dissolving into abject cowardice. He hid behind a bank of computers, peering over the top like a frightened turtle. The room went dead silent. The only movement was Thorn, tightening his grip on Sarah's neck, and Elias Vance, who had not moved. He stood at the edge of the bay, a small old man with a limp, silhouetted against the chaos. He looked at Thorn. He looked at Sarah's terrified, bulging eyes. He looked at the useless, panicked officers. He looked at Dr. Sterling cowering behind the desk. And in that moment, the 5 years of humiliation, the insults, the mop, the quiet suffering, it all burned away, leaving behind something cold and hard and infinitely dangerous. He didn't raise his hands. He didn't shout. He took one step forward, then another, his limp barely noticeable. His voice, when he spoke, was not the familiar rasp. It was a new sound, a low, gravelly command tone that cut through the fear-soaked air like a razor. "Let her go." Thorn, his focus on the armed cops, swiveled his massive head toward the sound. He saw Elias, a broken-down old man. He laughed, a horrifying, bubbling sound. "Or what, Grandpa? You gonna bore me to death with a bedtime story?" He squeezed Sarah's neck again for emphasis. A gurgling sound escaped her lips. Elias didn't flinch. He took another step. He was 10 feet away now. "You have 2 seconds," Elias said, his voice flat, devoid of any emotion. It wasn't a threat. It was a diagnosis. 1. He took another step. Thorn's drug-addled brain couldn't process it. The sheer lack of fear from this old man was disorienting. It didn't compute. "What did you say to me?" Thorn growled. Elias's left hand, the one on the side of his bad leg, subtly shifted, fingers curling slightly. His eyes weren't on Thorn's face anymore. They were locked on the space just below Thorn's jaw, on the carotid artery and the vagus nerve that lay beneath. 2. Elias moved. It wasn't the shuffle of an old man. It was an explosion of purpose. He closed the remaining distance in a single, fluid motion that defied his age and his limp. It wasn't a run. It was a glide, a predator closing on its prey. Thorn, startled by the suddenness, instinctively tried to tighten his grip on Sarah and turn. He was too slow. In the fraction of a second it took him to react, Elias was already inside his guard. 1. Elias's left hand shot up, not in a punch, but with a rigid, blade-like edge. He didn't strike the throat. He struck the brachial plexus in Thorn's armpit, the cluster of nerves that controlled the entire arm. The impact was precise, brutally efficient. Thorn's arm, the one crushing Sarah's throat, went instantly limp, as if the power had been cut. Sarah fell to the floor, gasping, choking, but alive. 2. As Thorne roared in pain and confusion, his brain struggling to understand why his arm no longer worked, Elias's right hand came up. He drove the heel of his palm upward under Thorne's jaw, the force directed not at the bone, but at the hinge, a temporomandibular joint disruption strike. It didn't break the jaw. It dislocated it with a sickening pop that was audible across the silent room. 3. Thorne was off balance. His head snapped back, his mouth agape in a silent scream he couldn't form. He was a giant, momentarily disabled. Elias pivoted on his good leg, his entire body coiling. He dropped his center of gravity and drove his right shoulder into Thorne's sternum. It wasn't just a push, it was a full-body takedown, using Thorne's own immense weight and forward momentum against him. The 280-pound giant, who had seemed an unstoppable force of nature seconds before, was lifted off his feet. He crashed backward, his head hitting the tile floor with a horrific, hollow thud that echoed through the ER. He landed and did not move again. It was over. The entire sequence, from Elias's first step to Thorne's unconscious body hitting the floor, had taken less than 3 seconds. The room was absolutely, profoundly silent. The only sound was Sarah, on her hands and knees, taking in huge, ragged gulps of air. The police officers stood frozen, their guns still pointed at a threat that no longer existed. The nurses and doctors peered out from behind counters and doorways, their faces a mixture of shock, disbelief, and awe. They had just watched a ghost become a god of violence. And then there was Dr. Sterling, slowly rising from behind his computer station, his face not relieved, but contorted in a mask of pure, unadulterated fury and humiliation. He pointed a trembling finger at Elias. "Arrest him!" he shrieked, his voice cracking like a terrified adolescent's. "Arrest that man right now! He assaulted my patient!" The 2 police officers, their minds still catching up to the blur of events, looked from their downed colleague to the unconscious behemoth on the floor, to the terrified but alive nurse, and finally to the quiet old man standing over the carnage. Elias hadn't moved. He was just looking down at Thorne's still form, his breathing even, his expression as calm as if he had just finished stocking a supply shelf. One of the cops, the senior of the 2, slowly lowered his weapon. "Assaulted your patient?" the cop repeated, his voice dripping with disbelief. "Sir, he just saved that nurse's life, and probably ours." Sterling, his face flushed a blotchy, furious red, stalked forward. His fear had been replaced by a desperate need to reassert his shattered authority. "That patient, as you call him, was under my care. This orderly took matters into his own hands. That is a criminal offense. He could have killed him. Look at him." He gestured wildly at the unconscious Thorne. "I am the chief physician in this department, and I am ordering you to take him into custody." The scene was surreal. In the middle of a mass casualty event, with dozens of injured people waiting for care, Dr. Sterling was attempting to have a man arrested for saving someone's life. Elias finally looked up from Thorne's body. He turned his head, and his pale blue eyes met Sterling's. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. The look was enough. It was a look of profound, weary contempt. It was the look a master craftsman gives a clumsy apprentice who has just broken an irreplaceable tool. Sterling visibly flinched, but doubled down on his tirade. "I want him cuffed. I want his license. I am calling the hospital administrator and the chief of police right now. You are finished, Vance. Do you hear me? Finished." He pulled out his phone, his hands shaking so badly he could barely unlock it. Just as he stabbed a number on the screen, the main ambulance bay doors slid open with a pneumatic hiss. But it wasn't another gurney. A man strode in, flanked by two stone-faced aides in crisp military uniforms. The man himself was tall and ramrod straight, despite his age. He wore a dark, impeccably tailored suit, but he moved with an economy and purpose that spoke not of boardrooms, but of battlefields. On his lapel was a small, discreet pin, 3 silver stars. A lieutenant general. His face was a roadmap of hard-won years, dominated by a pair of fiercely intelligent, piercing grey eyes. He swept his gaze across the chaotic scene, the injured patients, the blood, the cowering staff, the downed officer, the unconscious giant on the floor, and Dr. Sterling, phone in hand, mid-rant. The general's eyes saw it all in a second, assessing, processing, and then they stopped. They locked onto the quiet, limping old man in the faded grey scrubs. The general's entire demeanor shifted. The hard, assessing look softened into something else entirely. Recognition, disbelief, and a deep, profound respect. He ignored Dr. Sterling completely. He ignored the police officers. He walked directly toward Elias, his expensive leather shoes making no sound on the tiled floor. He stopped a few feet away, his aides fanning out behind him, forming a silent, imposing perimeter. The air in the ER seemed to crackle and shift, the ambient chaos fading into a focused, pin-drop silence around these two men. "Stitcher?" the general said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. It was a question, but it sounded like a prayer. Elias Vance's shoulders, which had been stooped for 5 long years, seemed to straighten. He met the general's gaze. A flicker of something ancient and shared passed between them, a memory of sand and blood and the screaming of jet engines. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "General Morrison," Elias rasped, "you're a long way from Kandahar." The name hung in the air. Stitcher. It meant nothing to the nurses or to Dr. Sterling, but to the general, it meant everything. He took a half-step closer, his eyes scanning Elias, taking in the cheap scrubs, the limp, the tired lines on his face. "What in God's name are you doing here?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. Before Elias could answer, Dr. Sterling, seeing his authority being completely usurped, made a fatal error. He stepped forward, puffing up his chest. "Excuse me," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "This man is a hospital employee, and he is in a great deal of trouble. I don't know who you are, but this is a medical emergency, and I am in charge here." General Morrison turned his head slowly to look at Sterling. It was a movement of immense, controlled menace, the full weight of his command presence, an aura honed by decades of sending men into battle, descended upon the arrogant young doctor. Sterling's bravado seemed to shrivel under that gaze. "You're in charge?" the general repeated, his voice dangerously soft. "You, who was hiding behind a desk while your nurse was being strangled? I saw the whole thing on the security feed from my car." The color drained from Sterling's face. He had no idea he'd been observed. The general turned his back on Sterling, a gesture of ultimate dismissal. He looked back at Elias. "My chopper went down on approach to the city helipad. Minor injuries, but my aide insisted we get checked out. They sent us here." He gestured around the chaotic ER. "And I walk into this. I find the man who held my guts in his hands for 3 hours on a godforsaken ridge, the man who I personally recommended for the Medal of Honor, mopping floors and being screamed at by this child." The general's voice grew louder with each word, a controlled burn of fury. The Medal of Honor. The words dropped into the silent room like grenades. The staff stared at Elias, their minds struggling to reconcile the image of the quiet, shuffling old man with the nation's highest award for valor. The fossil, the janitor. A hero of that magnitude? It was impossible. "Sir, I don't think you understand," Sterling stammered, his career flashing before his eyes. "This man, Vance, he assaulted a patient. He needs to be disciplined." The general laughed. It was not a pleasant sound. It was harsh, bitter, and utterly contemptuous. "You pathetic little man," he snarled, turning the full force of his fury on Sterling. "You call that unconscious piece of garbage a patient? I called him a hostile combatant who took a hostage, and you call what he did an assault?" He pointed a rigid finger at Elias. "Let me tell you what that man is. That is Master Sergeant Elias Vance, retired. They called him Stitcher because he could put a man back together in the middle of a firefight with nothing but a roll of duct tape and a prayer. He is credited with 247 battlefield saves. 247. Men who are alive today, who have children and grandchildren because of him." The general took a step closer to the trembling doctor, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. "I am one of those men. He performed a field thoracotomy on me with his Leatherman tool while under active machine gun fire. He kept me alive until the medevac arrived. The limp he has? He got that pulling my pilot out of the burning wreckage of that medevac. So you will stand there and you will not say another goddamn word." Sterling looked as if he'd been physically struck. He opened and closed his mouth, but no sound came out. His face was the color of ash. The sycophantic nurses who had laughed at Elias earlier now looked at the floor, their faces burning with shame. Sarah, the nurse Elias had saved, was openly crying, her tears a mixture of gratitude and shock. The hospital administrator, a portly man named Henderson with a perpetually worried expression, finally bustled onto the scene, drawn by the commotion. He saw the general, saw his stars, and immediately began to sweat. "General, I am so sorry. Is there a problem?" he asked, wringing his hands. General Morrison's eyes were chips of ice. "A problem? Mr. Henderson, you have a national hero, a Medal of Honor recipient working in your hospital, and your chief physician here has been using him as a personal servant and a punching bag. You have a problem, a very, very big problem." He turned to one of his aides. "Get me the Secretary of Defense on the phone, and the chairman of this hospital's board of directors. I know him personally. We play golf." Each word was a nail in the coffin of Dr. Sterling's career. Sterling let out a small whimpering sound and seemed to shrink inside his expensive scrubs. The power dynamic in the room hadn't just shifted. It had been utterly and irrevocably annihilated. The arrogant king of the ER was now just a terrified little boy, about to be crushed by a power he couldn't even comprehend. The immediate aftermath was a blur of controlled, efficient action. The general's presence seemed to impose order on the chaos. His aides, communicating on encrypted radios, coordinated with city and state authorities. Within minutes, a team of military police, disciplined and imposing, arrived to take custody of the still unconscious Marcus Thorne. They cuffed him to a specialized restraint board, their movements practiced and sure. There was no fanfare, just quiet, intimidating competence. The injured police officer was swiftly attended to by a new team of doctors who seemed to appear out of nowhere, his leg splintered and prepped for surgery. Through it all, Elias stood quietly, the unwilling center of the storm.
The other nurses and doctors
Kept their distance, their glances a mixture of awe, shame, and fear. They were looking at him, but they weren't seeing the man they thought they knew. They were seeing a legend, a ghost from a world of violence and valor they could barely imagine. Sarah, her neck bruised but her breathing steady, approached him hesitantly. "Thank you," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. You saved my life." Elias just looked at her, his pale eyes softening for the first time. "He was going to hurt you," he said, his voice back to its familiar, quiet rasp. "I couldn't let that happen." It was the simplest of statements, yet it held the weight of a lifelong creed. Another nurse, one who had often laughed at Sterling's jokes at Elias's expense, came forward and placed a fresh bottle of water on a nearby counter. "Mr. Vance, Sergeant, sir, I'm so sorry," she stammered, unable to meet his eyes before scurrying away. The apologies had begun.
General Morrison
Dismissed the hospital administrator with a curt nod. Henderson scurrying away like a frightened rabbit, promising a full and immediate investigation. Then the general turned back to Elias. The hardness in his face was gone, replaced by a deep, weary affection. "Elias," he said, his voice gentle, "come on, let's get you out of here." He placed a hand on Elias's shoulder, a gesture of profound camaraderie. He led him away from the center of the ER toward a quieter corner near the empty waiting room triage desks. "The leg," the general said, his eyes on Elias's slight limp. "Still giving you trouble?" Elias nodded. "Some days are better than others. The cold gets to it." "And the VA?" "They do what they can," Elias said, a non-answer that said everything. The general sighed, a heavy, frustrated sound. "I told you, Stitcher. My door is always open. You could have been training the next generation of combat medics. You could have had any civilian post you wanted.
Why here?
Why this?" He gestured back at the ER, at the life of quiet servitude and humiliation. Elias was silent for a long moment, looking at his own gnarled hands. Hands that had saved so many, yet had been used to mop floors and stock shelves. "After everything," he began, his voice low. "After the noise, the sand, the blood, I just wanted quiet. I wanted to be invisible. I wanted to help people without anyone knowing who I was, or what I'd done. I thought I could just disappear, be useful in a small way." "There's nothing small about you, Elias," the general said softly. He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a small, velvet-covered case. He opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of silk, was the Medal of Honor, its simple blue ribbon and golden star seeming to glow even in the harsh fluorescent light. "This belongs to you. The president awarded it in a closed ceremony as you requested.
I've held on to it.
Hoping one day you'd be ready to accept it." Elias looked at the medal, and for the first time, a flicker of deep, profound pain crossed his face. He saw the faces of the men who hadn't made it home, the men he couldn't save. "The men I lost, they're the real heroes, sir. Every soldier I know who has one of these says the same thing," the general countered gently, "and every single one of them is wrong. You earned this. You lived a code of honor that most men can't even comprehend. It's time you stopped hiding from it." He pressed the case into Elias's hand. This time, Elias didn't pull away. His fingers closed around the worn velvet. It felt impossibly heavy. Across the room, the final act of Dr. Sterling's public execution was underway. Two stern-faced individuals in dark suits, a hospital board member and a lawyer, had arrived. They were speaking to Sterling in low, clipped tones. There was no shouting, no drama, just a quiet, surgical dismantling of a career.
They took his ID badge.
They took his pager. Then, flanked by hospital security, they escorted a stunned, ashen-faced Adrian Sterling toward the exit. He didn't look at anyone. His reign was over. As he passed the corner where Elias and the general were standing, his eyes, full of a dawning, horrified understanding, met Elias's for one last time. There was no triumph in Elias's expression, only a deep, abiding sadness. Sterling had been a bully and a fool, but in the end, he was just another casualty of his own arrogance. Weeks turned into a month. The tectonic plates of life at Metro General settled into a new, strange alignment. The story of what happened that night became the hospital's enduring legend, told and retold with increasing embellishment. They no longer called him Old Man Vance or the Fossil. To the staff, he was now Mr. Vance, or, more often, just Sir. They spoke to him with a quiet reverence that bordered on fear. They offered him the best seats in the break room.
They brought him coffee.
They fell silent when he entered a room. Elias found the attention more uncomfortable than the insults had ever been. He had traded one form of isolation for another. Dr. Adrian Sterling was gone. He hadn't just been fired, he had been professionally erased. An internal review, spurred by General Morrison's outrage, had uncovered a pattern of negligence, falsified reports, and malpractice that Sterling's arrogance had long concealed. His medical license was suspended, pending a full hearing he was certain to lose. Rumor had it, he was facing multiple lawsuits, and his wealthy family had cut him off. He had vanished, a ghost of a different sort. His sycophants had either transferred to other departments or now treated Elias with a cloying, desperate deference that was almost as nauseating as their previous contempt. The hospital administration, terrified of the potential fallout from their treatment of a national hero, had offered Elias anything he wanted:
A promotion.
a management position, a newly created role as a senior training consultant with a massive salary. He had turned it all down. He didn't want a new title or more money. He just wanted to be a nurse. Finally, they reached a compromise. He remained a staff nurse in the ER, but his duties were different. He no longer stocked shelves or cleaned messes. He floated. He observed. He mentored. He was a living resource, a repository of experience that the younger staff could draw upon. One afternoon, during a lull, he found Sarah, the young nurse he'd saved, struggling to insert an IV into the fragile, paper-thin vein of an elderly woman. She was on her third try, her frustration mounting, the patient wincing with each failed attempt. "You're coming in too steep," a quiet, raspy voice said from behind her. She looked up to see Elias standing there, his hands in the pockets of his now pristine scrubs. "Let me show you something my first training sergeant taught me." He didn't take the needle from her. He gently guided her hand. "Lower your angle, almost parallel to the skin. Anchor the vein from below with your thumb, pull the skin taut. Now, slow and steady. Feel for the pop." Sarah followed his instructions. She adjusted her angle, anchored the vein, and advanced the needle. This time, it slid in perfectly. A perfect, beautiful flash of red appeared in the chamber. She secured the line, her hands moving with a newfound confidence. I got it," she said, beaming. The elderly patient smiled. "Thank you, dear. And thank you, Sonny," she said, looking at Elias. Elias just nodded. "Good work, nurse," he said to Sarah. He turned and walked away, his limp a steady, rhythmic counterpoint to the beeping of the machines. He passed the empty space where Dr. Sterling's personal locker used to be. He passed Crash Cart 2, now stocked by an eager new nursing student. He walked to a window and looked out at the city, the afternoon sun glinting off the glass towers. He was still here, in the noise and the chaos. But it was different now. The coldness in his gut was gone, replaced by a quiet warmth. He had spent so long trying to bury the soldier, to erase Stitcher, believing that part of his life was a source of pain and darkness. But he was beginning to understand. It wasn't a separate life. It was all one life. The skills that had saved a general in Kandahar were the same skills that had saved a nurse in a city ER. The hands that had held a dying soldier were the same hands that could guide a young nurse's. He reached into his pocket, and his fingers brushed against the hard edges of the velvet case the general had given him. He hadn't opened it again, but he kept it with him. A reminder. Not of what he had done, but of what he could still do. He wasn't a fossil. He wasn't a hero.
He was just a nurse.
And for the first time in a very long time, that felt like enough. It felt like everything. True worth is not in the medals you are given or the titles you hold. It is in the lives you touch, the knowledge you share, and the quiet dignity with which you carry your scars.